Pan. Captain Hook cries out during their final battle, "Who and what art thou?" And back comes the cocky reply, "I'm youth, I'm joy, I'm a little bird that's broken out of the egg." It's a remark that Barrie dismisses as nonsense. But it would be equally nonsensical to expect any definition to fit Peter Pan without him giving it the slip. Definitions of a people and ideas that are fixed. And Pan is a character who is always on the move. Lost child, action hero, innocent icon, egotistical monster, practical joker. You can't pin him down any more than you can catch hold of your own reflection. Since his first stage appearance in 1904, he starred in countless theatre productions worldwide, played by both male and female actors, at least 10 major films. In E.T., a mother reads her daughter the episode where Tinkerbell is brought back to life, shortly before her son does something similar for his extraterrestrial friend. In the US version of Queer as Folk, the gorgeous, narcissistic Brian is reassured he will be always young and always be beautiful, and is nicknamed Peter by a female friend he calls Wendy. What else? Well, Peter Pan has inspired the creation of statues, a ballet, a type of rounded collar, merchandise from cuddly toy crocodiles to Tinkerbell costumes, to glitter lamps. The girl's name, Wendy, here are some famous Wendy's, a brand of peanut butter, a Disneyland ride, a psychological complex, and a 190-metre long Scandinavian car ferry. Apparently, Pan, inappropriately enough, is everywhere. His creator is equally elusive. In his dedication to the script he finally published in 1928, Barrie pointed out that if you try to recall the past, you end up having to open a crammed drawer in your mind. If you're searching for anything in particular, he said, you don't find it, but something falls out at the back that is often more interesting. But when it came to the creation of Peter Pan, there seems to have been two things in particular that were lurking at the back of the drawer of his own mind. The first of these was a traumatic event that happened in his childhood, and it created a psychological wound he spent the rest of his life delicately probing. In January 1867, when Barrie was 6 years old, his older brother David was killed in a freak skating accident on the eve of his 14th birthday. His mother was broken by grief, and to cheer her up, Barrie decided, he said, to become so like him that even my mother would never see the difference. So he learnt to whistle like his brother. He learned to stand like him with his legs far apart and his hands thrust into his pockets. And above all, he started to think of boyhood as a state that was as fragile as a soap bubble unless it was preserved in memories, in photographs, and in stories. And even after he'd become a successful writer, Barrie never really escaped the long shadow cast by his own childhood. Cynthia Asquith, who worked as his secretary for many years, remembered him as, she said, a strange, sombre, dark little man with a deep hoarded sadness in his blue eyes. She suggested that if he really was an escape artist, as some of his critics said he was, he didn't look as if he'd succeeded in escaping. To adapt one of his own mournful jokes, he appeared to have been buried alive. Or as Barrie also said in another joke that wasn't really a joke, nothing that happens after we're 12 matters very much. So that was one of the things he kept in the crammed drawer of his mind, and he kept returning to it in early stories, many of which dealt with people who were stunted or stymied in some way. He was a boy only, he wrote of his hero Tommy in Tommy and Grizzle, a novel he published in 1900. He was a boy who could not grow up. Then a few years later, in his play The Admirable Crichton, after Lady Mary is shipwrecked on a desert island, she starts behaving like a naughty, sulky child, and then she reinvents herself as, Barrie says, a splendid boy clad in skins. So whether he was writing about remaining a child or returning to childhood, this idea that time could be reversed or stopped was like an itch he could never stop scratching. The other thing that increasingly filled up the drawer of his mind was his relationship with these three young brothers he met in 1897 in Kensington Gardens. 5-year-old George, 4-year-old Jack Llewellyn Davies were easy to spot. They wore bright red tam o' shanters. And soon Barrie befriended them and also their baby brother, Peter. If Barrie proved to be a surprisingly fascinating companion for 3 small boys, that might have been because he gave so few signs of actually being a grown-up. He wore an overcoat that was several sizes too large for him, as if secretly hoping that at just 5 feet tall, he might one day grow into it. He was accompanied by a huge St. Bernard dog named Porthos that made him look proportionately even smaller. He knew a lot about cricket. He could waggle his ears. He could make his eyebrows move up and down independently like highly trained caterpillars. He even seemed to be on intimate terms with fairies. And as he made up stories for the boys, that atmosphere of Kensington Gardens subtly changed around them until it became full of invisible darting forces. So the Davies boys then were good company for him, but they were even better copy. His little red notebooks quickly filled up with their various sayings and doings. George burying his face not to show crying, for instance, or the queer pleasure it gives when George tells me to lace his shoes, etc. And of course, these days it might be tempting to, well, number one, alert the social services. Number two, dismiss it as misty-eyed or mawkish. Actually, though, Barrie had a sort of brisk, no-nonsense attitude when it came to the behaviour of small boys. He was fully aware they were selfish as well as loving, and also that they were very easily distracted because they lived mostly in the present tense. And that made them incapable of true loyalty. But what Barrie really admired, though, was their freewheeling spirit of mockery, which allowed them to be fiercely committed to whatever they were doing at the time, but also be ready at any moment to step back, forget about it, ignore it, poke fun at it. Now, this was close to the attitude Barrie himself had towards his writing. So it's probably not surprising that he soon enlisted George, you see here in the centre, George Llewellyn Davies, in extended bursts of storytelling. Barrie later explained the process in his novel The Little White Bird. He said, when it came to creating a new story, first I tell it to him, then he tells it to me, the understanding being that it's a quite different story, and then I retell it with his additions, and so we go on, until no one could say whether it was more his story and mine. And soon their attention would turn to making up some adventures for George's baby brother, Peter. So Peter Pan was on his way. Meanwhile, Barrie carried on cultivating his relationship with the Davies family. These days, of course, we might call it grooming. At the time, a rather different attitude. He met the boys' parents. Not unreasonably, they were rather wary of this charming, moody author who seemed to have unofficially adopted their own children despite the fact that they were still alive. But eventually, in 1901, they agreed the whole family would spend some part of the summer in a Surrey village called Tilford, which was a 5-minute walk away from Barrie's holiday home, Black Lake Cottage. And this turned out to be one of the most important summers in all of their lives. For several weeks, they enjoyed a steady diet of Barrie's stories and games, swimming in the lake. And after they returned home, they discovered that he had produced the most extraordinary printed souvenir of their time they'd spent together as a kind of lopsided band of brothers. It was something that would make those warm summer days last much longer than their own fickle boy memories. It was this, The Boy Castaways of Black Lake Island. It was a proper book. It was bound in maroon cloth, printed on thick cream paper with gilt edges, and published in a strictly limited edition. 2 copies. It was also one of the sweetest and strangest things Barrie ever wrote. There's only 1 copy survives, which is in America. Most of the pages were taken up with a selection of photographs that Barrie had taken. They were gummed in place, they were protected by gauzy sheets of tissue paper. And they showed the boys playing outdoors. And then accompanying these photographs were blood-quickening captions, a detailed list of contents, and a mock preface that was supposedly written by the tiny Peter Llewellyn Davies. And all of this indicated this wasn't just an ordinary photo album. It was a set of glimpses into an adventure story the boys and Barrie had been acting out together all summer. It's a bit like Peter Pan, who looks through the nursery window at the end of Barrie's play. These were photographs that captured a world that Barrie could observe from the outside, but from which he would always be excluded. But they also represented a more optimistic alternative. He would later claim that to be born is to be wrecked on an island. But in The Boy Castaways, he created an environment in which childhood could remain forever safe from the rising waters of age. A bit like in this photograph here. Here are 2 little boys who will always remain little. You add some more echoes of Barrie's childhood reading, like the crocodile a child thinks is living on the island in the Swiss Family Robinson. And the main elements of Peter Pan are starting to slot into place. The trigger, though, the trigger seems to have been an evening in December 1901 when Barrie took the Davies family to see Seymour Hicks's latest Christmas spectacular, Bluebell in Fairyland, kind of pantomime. It was billed as a musical dream play, and it was a modern fairy tale, one in which a flower girl sees Peter, the cat, outside her garret window, and then she decides to accompany him to Fairyland, where she meets an assortment of magical creatures, including an elusive fairy named Will-o'-the-Wisp. And then the story that Barrie started to plan under the loose working title of Fairy Play would take all those ingredients and it would shape them together and it would transform them into a story that was new, but somehow gave every indication of having been there all along. How did he do it? Well, in 1902, Barrie jotted down some ideas in one of his notebooks. And they included play the happy boy, boy who can't grow up, runs away from pain and death, is caught wild, end escapes. And then after that, more simply, he wrote Peter Pan. Why Pan? Well, since the 1890s, a minor cult of Pan had developed in literary circles, providing a kind of classical alibi for writers who wanted to explore potentially risky themes of social or sexual transgression. There were stories by Max Beerbohm, Robert Louis Stevenson, Arthur Machen, Somerset Maugham, Algernon Blackwood, Saki, E.M. Forster, I could go on. A little bit later, there was this. Kenneth Graham's story, The Wind in the Willows, includes an episode where Ratty and Mole search the river for a missing baby otter. and then discover him sleeping happily between the hooves of a mysterious being with curved horns and rippling muscles, after they're drawn to him by the thin, clear, happy call of a distant piping. So this is Pan, the nature god, Pan, the protector, Pan, the stranger in our midst. But by the turn of the century, the edge of danger in this kind of encounter had largely been smoothed away. And Barrie's creation of a boy dressed only in autumn leaves and cobwebs, as he said, reflected a common desire to turn Pan into a more youthful, playful figure. So whereas previously Pan had been used to celebrate man's deep hidden connections to the natural world, the Edwardian Pan was being transformed into a reminder of another potentially savage state, namely childhood. Now this of course chimed very strongly with Barrie. And that's because Barrie had long been fascinated by the imaginative creativity and the moral carelessness and the acts of random cruelty that most ordinary boys displayed every day. Grafting Pan onto one of this tribe was therefore partly a joke, but it was also a serious suggestion that boys might indeed be somehow loosely related to this mythic figure with a beautiful face, with the shaggy hindquarters and hooves of a goat. For a boy was, like Peter Pan, already a betwixt and between creature. That's how Pan is described in the earliest version that Barrie wrote, a betwixt and between. A boy's ability to strut around like a little god couldn't disguise the fact that he was also capable of acting like a little beast. So that's the Pan side of Peter Pan. Why Peter and not Michael or George? Why isn't this George Pan or Michael Pan? It sounds ludicrous now, but it's logically exactly the same as Peter Pan. So why not? Well, it might just have been a matter of alliterative convenience. There's no more logic in him being called Peter Pan than there is in Peter Piper picking a peck of pickled peppers. But the reference in Barrie's notebook to a happy boy being caught wild, I think suggests he might have had another model in mind. Peter the Wild Boy had long been a source of fascination among those who wondered whether it would be possible for a human being to exist in a purely natural state, and whether we'd like it much if it were. According to one account, Peter the Wild Boy was discovered in 1725 in a wood near Hanover, and here I'm quoting, walking on his hands and feet, climbing trees like a squirrel, and feeding on grass and moss. He was supposed to be about 13 years old and could not speak. So in effect, he was like a character from a fairy tale who'd accidentally wandered into real life. And his contemporaries weren't slow to pick up on that suggestion. They dressed him up in forest green. They made him the subject of stories that either applauded his innocence or shuddered over his backwardness. And Barrie might have especially appreciated the fact that Peter the Wild Boy remained trapped in a kind of childhood limbo long after he had officially, biologically, become an adult. And not only was he unable to tell right from wrong, he seemed oblivious to anything that existed beyond the shifting surfaces of ordinary life. As Michael Newton says in his History of Feral Children, nothing impresses him. Everything flattens out under his steady, unconcerned gaze, and he would watch a woman burnt at the stake as unmoved as if he were watching a dance at the theatre. It isn't far from this to Peter Pan's reaction in the first draft of Barrie's play when Hook is swallowed by the giant crocodile rearing up out of the Serpentine in this draft. Peter, he says, Peter has been looking on unconcernedly at the incident and still whistling. Peter the Wild Boy. As for the rest of Barrie's story, well, other sources, other influences, isn't there something a bit creepy, a bit vampire-like about the way that Peter Pan flies through windows never seems to get any older. What are some of the other pieces of writing that seems to have snagged in Barrie's memory? Writings like Robert Louis Stevenson's poem My Shadow, that describes a child being separated from its shadow when a child gets up before sunrise. You add all this together, and Barrie's laconic note about Peter Pan starts to look less like a character's name and more like the solution to an immensely complicated cultural puzzle. So what happened? Well, it would be good to report this is a story with a happy ending. Unfortunately, that's not true. In Barrie's first draft of the play, Neverland was in fact Never, Never, Neverland. It's a name that was painfully close to King Lear's lament for his dead child Cordelia. Thou'lt come no more, he says. Never, 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 never. And in Barrie's case, that tragic potential would be remorselessly fleshed out over the years. One by one, those close to him died. The boy's father, Arthur Llewellyn Davies, cancer. His wife Sylvia, cancer. George, shot in the First World War trenches. Peter Pan's first producer, Charles Frohman, drowned on the Lusitania. Michael, drowned while swimming here in Oxford. Barrie outlived them all. Peter Llewellyn Davies did survive him, but after a lifetime of being pursued by newspaper headlines like Peter Pan fined for speeding and, get this, Peter Pan becomes publisher, in 1960 he committed suicide by throwing himself in front of a London Underground train. Under the ground, of course, being where the Lost Boys lived. Meanwhile, Barrie's most famous story had become, somehow, as timeless and as impersonal as a myth. While the character of Peter Pan didn't grow up, the story of Peter Pan certainly did. Every year it grew bigger and stronger. There were songs, poems, magic lantern slides, a comedian who adopted Peter Pan as his stage name, Wendy houses to play in, dolls to play with, a Peter Pan restaurant on Shaftesbury Avenue, Christmas crackers with mottos culled from the play, wobbly cardboard figures, you can see at the bottom there, for a toy theatre. There was even a Peter Pan golf club that Barrie set up. The story's iconography also refused to settle down into just one shape. There were illustrations that ranged from the kind of tangled wildness of Arthur Rackham, those watercolours there on the left, to what another critic's called the dimpled cuteness of the figures churned out by Mabel Lucy Atwell there on the right. But while Neverland was expanding its borders, Barrie was shrinking further inside himself. According to George Llewellyn Davies' sister-in-law, there was something very sinister about him, rather shivery. One of Michael's friends said that when you met him, the most self-confident people in the world became as if they had a raw lemon in their mouths. And perhaps the sourest sense of disappointment was felt by anyone who wanted Barrie somehow to be Peter Pan, witty and wild, crackling with mischief. But Barrie could never bring himself to be as unself-conscious as his hero. Thus it will go on, the last sentence of Peter and Wendy promised, so long as children are gay and innocent and heartless. It was a cry from the heart of a man who worried he didn't have a heart. Barrie died in 1937, but of course the story goes on. Since the final mothballing of Busico's original production, Peter Pan has been reinvented so often, it's become something of a cultural mirror. It's been used to catch our reflections on everything from the benefits of moisturiser to this, Neverlands. The ranch that was home to Michael Jackson, that strange musical man-child who for many years was described with admiration and with scorn as the Peter Pan of pop. So flitting here and there, flattering and mocking, Peter Pan has become the perfect self-image of an age, ours, that is obsessed with age. Every time its hero seems to have gone for good, he reappears on the windowsill, asking us to come back and play. To it again, as Hook cries out after Peter tells him he's a little bird that's broken out of an egg. To it again.